Welcome to Knock Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk Weekly Parsha. This week, introducing a new rabbi, David Fredman. That's good to know because in a little while you're going to want to take his email address down, and I promise you probably will write down Friedman instead of Fredman. It's just such a common name. So there we go. Rabbi, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you on board, and glad you're able to join us. That you are a fresh face, would you tell just a brief introduction about you? Because I know that you have, besides being a rabbi, you have some other cool stuff you're involved in. Tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe how you met Rabbi Mollot, and then I'll just turn it over to you and give you what you need.
Thank you. So I was running an outreach branch called Torah in Minneapolis for a number of years, from 2012 till about 2019, and before that did rabbinical work as well, outreach work in the Seattle area for about 4 years. And Rabbi Mollot and I, we actually studied under the same rabbi. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz, who runs the Torah Institution in Jerusalem, as well as another institution called the Jerusalem Kollel. That's where we both study together. And besides that, I also have a full-time practice as a therapist, as a marriage and family therapist here in St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm based out of. So the rabbinical work has really been, at this point, transitioned more into a couple classes a week at best, and then also really mostly engaging at this point in couples therapy and family therapy. As a retired rabbi.
Awesome. BetterWayRelationships.com. Excellent. I like that. Okay, so thank you for that. And so now if you want to, we'll jump right into it. Deuteronomy 3:23, Vayetchanan. And maybe just a brief, in case somebody missed last week, maybe just a really super quick overview of how we got to where we're at now, and then just take it away.
Sure. So this is really the last farewell of Moses, of Moshe. He's kind of, most of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' kind of the last speech. It's a long speech. It takes us a bunch of weeks to read, but ultimately it's Moshe's last Torah and Moses' last speech to the Jewish people. And in this specific portion, we begin with, and I'll translate from the Hebrew, Va'etchanan al Hashem, that Moshe says that he supplicated, he begged, he pleaded to God to allow him into the land of Israel. As many of us are probably familiar, Moses was barred from the land, and yet he wanted so badly to go in. And it says that Vayetchanan, he prayed, he pleaded to God to allow him in. Rashi, the super commentator, right on the spot, he points out that the language used, the Hebrew word Vayetchanan, that he supplicated, actually is a similar word. Basically, he asked God for a freebie. God, please just let me into the land of Israel. Even though he was so righteous, even though he had so many merits to accrue to his name, he asked specifically for a free gift from God to allow him into the land of Israel. Of course, that kind of begs the question, if he was such a great person, why didn't he kind of cash in some of his merits at that point and say, God, look, ultimately, the last 40 years of putting up with your people in pretty difficult circumstances, at the very least, you could let me in. The analogy that I once heard, and I think this is so apropos to us in our life's mission, where the analogy that I heard from Rabbi Ezriel Tauber of blessed memory, who was a Holocaust survivor himself, and he pointed out, he said, imagine at the time that there was discussion with Hitler that they would negotiate Jews for money. Of course, the Germans needed money to maintain the war efforts, but they also wanted to get rid of as many Jewish people and many others as they could. And imagine if we would give an analogy and say that, you're the millionaire who, somebody comes to and says, look, we can trade, 6 million for 6 million, 6 million lives for $6 million. And so you jump at the opportunity and you give all your money away to save so many lives. What an amazing feat. Now, but when you come home, you just gave away all your money and you come to empty cupboards. So at that time, you're kind of faced with the dilemma. How do you relate to God under those circumstances? So you could say, look, Hashem, God, I kind of gave up everything for you. The least you could do is give me some bread as well, sustain me. Or you can turn it around, look at it a little bit of a different way. God, you had so many different people to choose from, to be your emissary and your ambassador, to do this great act of saving so many lives. And yet you chose me specifically, really because of that merit, that honor, the merit that I had to be your ambassador. Really, I can't ask for anything after that. But do me a favor, Hashem. Do me a favor, God. Please give me for free. And he pointed out, Rabbi Talbert did, that was kind of Moses' attitude about his role with the Jewish people. You could look at it as like he did God, it wasn't looking good for you in Egypt. Your people were being subjugated and enslaved. It was terrible for them. And I took them out of Egypt. The least you could do is let me into the land of Israel. But Moses' attitude was very different. God, you had other leaders. You had Aaron, you had Phinehas, you had other people that could have taken this role, and you chose me. By all rights, I have nothing left.
Was one of the reasons for Moshe not being able to enter, did it have anything to do with striking her?
So we're told that the specific reason, it's actually interesting because there's a debate amongst the early commentators exactly what he did wrong. It's just so fascinating. It was so slight, but he was held so accountable, either when he was told to speak to the rock to bring out water just a few portions ago and close to the end of the book of Numbers in Bamidbar, where he was told to speak to the rock and he hit the rock. That's one interpretation. Or that he got angry at the Jewish people. He called them rebellious. So whatever the specific wrongdoing was, the verse says that you failed to sanctify me in that spot, and therefore you no longer can enter. It's fascinating what we kind of lost by Moses not coming in. It says, had Moses gone into the land, then the Jewish nation, the world would have come to its fruition. It would have come to the plan that God had originally for Adam and Eve. And we would have been a game ender right there. We would have gone into the Messianic era. And unfortunately, Moses was banned, of course, and Joshua went in, and though it was great, it wasn't not quite the Messianic era at that stage. So, but that concept of how we view our missions in life, we can kind of get, haughty and say, look, I did so much. That's one view of it. And God, you owe me. That's one attitude to have. The Moses attitude, that humble attitude of, God, you allowed me to be this person. Wow. And there were so many other people to choose from. Thank you for allowing me this. And please grant me something as well. I'm asking as a matnas chinam, as a free gift, God, from that place of humility. And I think that's such an apropos way of thinking about the things that we accomplish in our life, and to appreciate that. I think we take that from Moses. I'm going to kind of go to that second point. I'm obviously happy to field other questions along that first track. But as we continue to go through the Torah portion, I'm going to hit a few stopping points, and we probably won't get through everything, meaning we won't get through the entire portion, but I like to see some highlights that really jumped out for me when I was doing some review.
That works.
The very next verse is so interesting. It says, "Atachi lota laharot et avdecha." I'll say it in Hebrew and then English. You are beginning. You just began to show me. This is at the end of Moses' life. God, he says to God, you just atachi lota laharot et avdecha. You just began to show me.
Rabbi, what verse are we on right now?
It's 324.
Oh, 324. Oh, I passed it up. There you go. Thank you. I'll put it on.
He says, you just began to show me. His attitude about his learning and everything that he had understood about godliness and the world and other human beings, he felt like it was just a drop. I'm just getting started here. This was the end of his life, 120 years. And yet his attitude was, give me more. I'm just getting started here. And every moment, that thirst and that hunger for life. The continuation, it says in 327, there's 327 and 320 have a very interesting dynamic, interesting combination. It says, Ale Rosh HaPisga. He told them basically, go up and search, north, west, south, east. Look around, Moses, and see what the land is. And then the next, very, very next verse is, if I recall correctly, command Joshua. You're not going in, okay? Look around, and then tell Joshua because he's the one who's going in. This seems a little bit torturous, if you will. God is kind of like, it seems like God's almost like teasing Moses. When you put that little thing in front of the child and, dangle it and then you pull it away. Although I don't think that's a proper conduct. I don't think Judaism would ascribe to that. So I don't know if it's a good thing to trick children, but at the end of the day, that's kind of, if you read the verse straight, it almost seems that Moses is kind of being taunted, if you will, by God. And of course, we know a good God doesn't taunt, human beings. So trying to better understand what was the command that he was told to go up and look at the land, but you're not going in, and then to give it to Joshua, give it to Joshua. So the concept that I've understood from my teachers, his name is Rabbi Aaron Lopiansky in Silver Spring, Maryland. He points out that when we think about our own spiritual growth, so typically we want very concrete actions of what to do, and tell me the next thing to do. If I'm tell me the next book to study, and then I'm going to become more enlightened, or let me fast for a day, and then I'm going to become great and spiritual. I'm going to kind of negate my body's needs. Okay, so we think of like these very concrete actions as the way to righteousness. But he pointed out, when we have a deeper appreciation for something spiritual, that in and of itself is growth. So what happens with Moses? He's going to go up. He's going to see the land of Israel. He's not going to be able to go in. He's not going to be able to taste it, so to speak. But just putting his eyes on it, that in and of itself changes who he is. That vision of what he saw. I don't know if he saw floating angels per se, but whatever he saw in that action when he went up and looked around, that already was a step forward. And so we start to appreciate how minute actions, even and I'll say the Hebrew word and then in English, a new hasaga, a new view of the world, a new understanding of the world. Sometimes, I read books about great Torah giants, study great leaders of the Torah world. There are many, many such biographies. And sometimes I'm sometimes awestruck by the level of sensitivity that they have to other human beings. And I think to myself, gosh, I don't know that I can ever live that truly. But wow, I appreciate that there's such a thing like that exists in the world, and that there's a human being who I just read about that acted that way and lived that way and expands what could be for me. Even if I never get there, the expanding of what's possible in the world of godliness and righteousness and care for others. The first thought that comes across my mind when I'm thinking that, so I'm sure many of you are familiar that on a daily basis, we wear a talit, we wear a prayer shawl. The way we put the prayer shawl on, we kind of wrap ourselves in it. And there's a famous statement, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit further about him a little later in this program. Rabbi Israel Salanter, the head of the Musar movement, he said, you're connecting to God, you're putting this prayer shawl across your entire body, and it can be a very special, sensitive moment, spiritual moment. He says, make sure that the tassels that are connected to that shawl don't whack anybody in the face. Meaning, when you're doing something spiritual, be mindful of how it impacts other people. Maybe it makes somebody uncomfortable. Maybe it perturbs somebody. And there's always this delicate balance between my own spiritual growth and how it might impact another human being. And so just kind of that's an expansion of mind. Wow. But I just want to do my own spiritual thing. Who cares about you? No. That's also factored in. And if it's going to offend somebody, maybe it's not the right thing to do, which is these kinds of calculations are constant, and they take a lot of scientific, if you will, decisions of what's the right thing for me under these circumstances. Well, I'll kind of give you the floor if you want to ask anything or talk about that at all.
No, the only thing I was going to ask earlier was whenever it came time for Moshe Rabbeinu was pleading with Hashem, I think the Midrash said he pleaded with him for an enormous amount of times until finally Hashem was like, enough. So, right. Could you kind of tell us a little bit about that? You don't have to spend too much time on it. It was just a curiosity I had. So.
Sure. I'm going to focus on one aspect of that. I think there's a few ways to take that question.
Okay.
I'm going to take it from the following angle. There's so many things. There's so many needs in the world. There are sick people, and there are people who don't have money, and there are people who are just hurting emotionally, physically. There's so many things. And then we pray, and a person can get disheartened and say, look, God, I tried, I prayed, and God didn't respond. And it can be painful. It can be painful to continue praying and praying and praying and praying and feel like God's not truly answering the prayers that we asked for. And God wants us to pray. It's actually a commandment that we have to pray to God, interestingly enough. And yet, how do we not give up? So I think we look at Moses and the hundreds of prayers that he did, supplicated to go into the land of Israel. And it teaches us a really profound lesson of prayer that we're never to give up. I think about Abraham and Sarah. They didn't have a child. A decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. I assume they continued praying. I assume they continued praying for decades. And that's tenacity. And we don't know the effects of prayer in the metaphysical sense. We don't know all of the where the prayers go specifically. You know what? When I think this is actually another concept of Israel Tower, it's a worthwhile detour, I believe. He says that there's 2 kinds of prayers. There's the Rachel prayer and the Leah prayer. Okay, we're not going to get too Kabbalistic in this forum, but these are 2 tracks of prayer. And if you look back in the early parts of Genesis, when these 2 great figures of the Jewish nation, were starting, Leah's prayers were very impactful for her. It says that she cried, and she got what she wanted. She became the mother, one of the great mothers of most of the tribes of the Jewish people,
right.
And she was the leader. She was she's the mother of the Jewish people. And Rachel also prayed. She also wanted to be a mother of the tribes of the Jewish people, and yet. She had Benjamin, and she had Joseph and Benjamin, which were great leaders, but she didn't quite get everything quite the way Leah did. So Rabbi Tauber explained, there's 2 kinds of prayers, and I'm not going to, where he gets this from is actually at the end of Bereshit, at the end of the book of Genesis. But there's 2 kinds of prayers. There's the prayers that have a very impactful, direct intervention in my life. That's the Leah prayer. And then there are prayers that are very long range, and they don't immediately impact, but they carry weight for generations. It says that Rachel is the one that cries. She cries for her children, and we kind of call on her merit. So her tears lasted for generations, thousands of years, and they still impact the Jewish world, the world today. And so understanding your prayer, it might be effective, but not for you directly like a Leah. That doesn't mean you give up. The analogy that Rabbi Tauber gave, he said, when a person passes away, imagine a family that has, 5 to 10 kids, whatever, and they get up to heaven, and God says, we're going to give you credit for, 6 kids, and you're going to get credit for all the babysitting and the diapers and everything you did to raise the children. But the actual child, you're getting credit for 6. They said, but what do you mean? We had 10. He said, yeah, but did you pray for those children? So you don't get credit for that. You get credit for the 6, and you get credit for raising 10, but you don't get credit for the child. Now, there's a family that comes up. Unfortunately, they didn't have any children. And they get up to heaven, and they have 1,000 children. And they say, God, why do I have credit for 1,000? See all those? See that prayer, that heartfelt prayer right there? Nice. See that family over in Philadelphia? That's yours. That kid's yours. See that family in Austin, Texas over there? That's your child. That's your prayer. That's long range. And so when we come back to those prayers are never lost. Prayers, true heartfelt prayer does not get lost. It might get redirected or redistributed. Is that painful? Sure. But keep in mind that the pain that we have is a big generator for true heartfelt prayer. It's hard to pray for something that you really don't need. It's hard to feel it. And God gives us a lack. He gives us the pain of the lack so that we continue to pray. But sometimes those prayers don't directly intervene in our life like Leah. Sometimes we see that very clearly it does. So those hundreds of prayers of Moses is such a fantastic. Don't stop praying. If God tells you to stop praying, I say, okay, you could stop. But for most of us, we're not getting such a clear divine message. And I'll say one other thing with regards to this. It's such an important point. I think in the back of every prayer, kind of like a fail-safe, I try to put this into my prayer as a fail-safe. God, I want this thing so deeply. It hurts how much I want it. But God, that's what I think is good for me. If it's truly not good for me, can you just override me and just not give it to me? Because I don't want to do spiritual harm to myself. Though my perception of the world is such that I think this is really good, just also know that if it's really bad for me, don't give it to me. And I think that's because, okay, you've begged me 500 times, I'm going to give it to you, like a parent. But maybe it's really, but sometimes if we give everything that our children wanted, those of us who have children, we would create little monsters. And sometimes we have to say no. And sometimes we know better, even though the child is pleading and begging. So thinking about it from quite a number of angles.
So it was really, I'm glad you went that way, because it's an aspect I never actually thought about, because now that you spun it that way, it made me think about Hannah, and her prayer for a child. It says that she prayed for a really long time, which means that she started praying and she didn't quit. She kept petitioning, and then Eli thought she was drunk because she was crying so much. So, and even though the prophet, told her, sober up or whatever, it's like she still pushed anyway. And I was like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah,
very cool.
She pushed, and that's the right thing to do. It's right to ask. Look, even part of my Rabbi Mollot's rabbi as well, Rabbi Berkowitz, he points out, he said, God, when we see the world in the way that makes sense to us, that's our duty to call. That's our duty to prayer. We view a world that seems topsy-turvy. God, if I, with all due respect, and Abraham, this is the way Abraham prays. He says, this is in the portion called Vayera. It's the fourth Torah portion. He says, God, God's willing. He's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God, and Abraham kind of comes to God, with all due respect, I don't think you should do this. This isn't the way to go. And he continues. That dialogue continues. Meaning, if I view the world in a particular way, and I don't think God's sorry to say this, I hope I don't sound heretical. If I don't think God's doing a good job, if that's the way I truly understand it, my job is to pray. God, I think the world should look a little bit different. Now that's an interaction. That's a relationship, just like we do with our spouses or people who we love. I don't think it should go this way. And there was a real back and forth. At the end of the day, in that circumstance, God did destroy those cities, and Abraham was like a faithful, child, like a faithful servant. He says he gave in. He said, okay, this is the way. And Abraham in a certain sense didn't quit his relationship just because he didn't get his way. He felt that because he saw the world in a particular way, he said, this is antithetical to everything that I know about you, God. Don't do this. And so we, as responsible human beings, when we engage in prayer, part of prayer is, I think the world should look a little bit differently, God. And that's my responsibility, to jump in and pray that things should be different. Ultimately, okay, we understand God runs the world. Ultimately, God has the best interests of humanity in mind, though sometimes very, very difficult to perceive in our own lives. We don't have the context of infinity, okay? We're limited. And at the same time, that is part and parcel of our prayer. When I see the world in a particular light, if I feel as Hannah did, hey, I'm a human being that has the capability of carrying a child, and that's what she so deeply desired. And if you look in the Tractate Brachot, how she describes, how she said, God, what did you give me? The equipment, the physical equipment to house a child and to feed a child. You gave me this. And you're not giving me a child. It's so contradictory to what I'm about. And she continued and continued and continued. Thankfully, we had the great prophet Samuel Shmuel as a result of that.
That's nice. And I wonder if Abraham had not prayed to Hashem over all those cities, and maybe just was more passive about it, if Lot and his family would have actually been destroyed in the city, with the city.
It's a good. I never thought about. That's a really interesting side of things. What were the actual effects? Maybe that they were tipped off and the angels came. That's a very interesting thought. I never put that together, and I love that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Very good. All right.
So we'll continue on the journey. I really do appreciate the questions. In chapter 4, verse 2, there's a really fascinating verse. It's actually the Torah mitzvah, one of the 613 commandments, two of the 613 commandments. It says you should not add or subtract of the mitzvot. meaning God has a prescription as to what a mitzvah, what a commandment looks like. And it's our responsibility to follow to a T what those commandments are and not to add or subtract. Unfortunately, we learn early on in the book of Genesis, if you look in the back of the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, verse 3, when the Nachash, the snake, is interacting with Chava, with Eve, and she says, what was the commandment? Don't eat from the tree and don't touch it. Now, there was no commandment not to touch the tree. Right. She added that. And there was a lot of downfall, because the Midrash, if I recall correctly, says that the snake kind of shoved her into the tree. See, nothing happened. You didn't die. So that the fact that something was added made it worse, because then when it was kind of undermined, then the whole mitzvah went out the window. The whole commandment went out the window. Now, there's an interesting point, an interesting addendum to this. Okay, so we're not allowed to add or subtract from the commandment, meaning we have to follow the commandment as we're told to do. Of course, there's obviously a lot of oral law on how exactly to perform a mitzvah. In fact, in the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moses, it's almost impossible to quantify exactly what to do as it relates to almost any mitzvah. If you think about the most basic mitzvah of honoring one's parents, what exactly are the parameters for the honor? How do I honor one's parents? What does that mean practically? Who decides that? So the oral Torah teaches us exactly what the prescription, if you will. Sorry to kind of make it so clinical, but the prescription of what the mitzvah entails. But we also have many rabbinic injunctions and commandments across the spectrum of what proper conduct is to do that kind of seems to fly in the face of this commandment not to add or subtract from the mitzvah. I hope that question is clear.
Sure.
So if we have, yeah.
Yep. Very good.
So how does that all fit in? Meaning, how do the rabbis or the rabbinical sages or the courts, rabbinical courts, how do they have a quote unquote right to seemingly add to the mitzvah? Meaning, from a pure standpoint, eating meat and milk for a Jewish person, if it's cooked together, cooking and eating meat and milk together, big problem. But technically, chicken and milk, there's from a Torah standpoint, it's not prohibited. With the definition of what meat and milk is. So how do we have this? And yet, the average, the person who's keeping kosher is probably not going to be eating chicken and milk. So that's a rabbinic injunction. So how does that not fly in the face of adding on? Doesn't that seem to add on to the mitzvah? So Maimonides clues us in, as well as other medieval commentators, and they say it depends how the rabbinic injunction is initially put out there to the congregation. Meaning, if it's posed as this is what the Torah is telling us to do, that's a problem, as we see by Chava, by Eve. Right? She said, God said, don't touch it either. God didn't do that. God didn't say that. They might have set up a fence to protect us from ourselves, or from Adam and Eve might have set up a fence. Hey, you know what? We're not allowed to eat from it, but let's just try to avoid this space. It's probably just not a good idea. As we know, almost every single circumstance in life that's serious has that. I mean, I took some of my family to the Grand Canyon, and they're in certain areas around there, there's fences, right? We don't want people to just fall off. And so understanding that there's areas that are, because of the severity or the potential danger, we don't want people to come too close to the edge. So when the rabbis make an injunction, then they tell us, hey, keep a little bit of a distance from the actual prohibition. And they formulate it in that way. That's fine. If they say, no, this is actually what the Torah says, then that becomes problematic. I want to take that actually into our own lives, because psychologically, we can almost rationalize anything. And so understanding our own psyches and our own personal, proclivities and idiosyncrasies becomes an actual mitzvah to protect ourselves from ourselves. Meaning, if you know that you're going to be gossiping and speaking negatively about people because when you get into this particular environment or with this group, so put a fence for yourself protect yourself from yourself. I know if I'm with this group of people, my tongue starts to wag. I say really nasty things. I don't speak in a dignified way. I'm going to avoid that. Now, those actions might be wrong. The step before that is to say, I'm going to protect myself from that. And those are kind of how we look at those rabbinical injunctions. A loving parent understands their child's tendencies and weaknesses and tries to set up safeguards to prevent them from harming themselves. And just, one analogy like that, if let's say a person has, their child has, God forbid, diabetes or something like that. So, one parent says, don't go into the donut shop. Okay. The other parent says, don't even go on the block. It's not from a place of harshness or cruelty. It's from a place of love and care. And so all those rabbinic injunctions, when they're formulated in that place of, we care about your soul, this is everlasting. We're playing for keeps here. Let's give ourselves a little bit of a buffer zone. And also for each one of us individually to create those buffer zones for ourselves. Kind of give you back to you if you have any questions on that.
Sorry, I took a moment to respond to somebody in the chat room.
No problem.
So very good. And so we've the chat room is set up now for members of the YouTube channel. We typically have a lot of people come in. A lot of them aren't very nice, and they tend to kind of mock what we're doing, and it makes it kind of hard for everybody to focus. So I'm like, well, if we create memberships, then everybody, surely they're not going to spend money to come into the channel. And it's only like $5 a month, but still, hopefully it'll be a little bit of a deterrent to kind of keep our chat room clean. So anyway, so I was just responding to somebody in chat. So okay, so what rough verse are we at here?
We're going to go to 439. Chapter 4, verse
it.
39.
You got it.
And I will start off with a geography lesson. The furthest two places in the entire universe. Where are the furthest two places in the entire universe?
In the universe?
Universe.
I would say
a hard question.
Heaven and hell. I don't know.
Heaven and hell. Okay. There's a famous quip of Rabbi Israel Salanter. He's the rabbi who started what's called the Musar movement in the 1800s. Musar, M-U-S-S-A-R, basically ethical teachings. He was trying to help develop the personality, the human personality and psyche, so that the more the personality is developed, the more in concert we can act with Torah principles. As we know, the concept that the Torah is a grower. So whatever we have developed inside of us, whatever traits, qualities, and characteristics we've developed, the Torah will magnify those and grow those. Obviously, if we're growing flowers in our personality, so to speak, those are going to grow and be fragrant and beautiful. If we grow weeds, the Torah will grow that as well. So what Israel Salanter was trying to do is kind of like, let's pull the weeds out and let's grow the roses and the tulips, etc. Now, he says the furthest two places in the entire universe is the head and the heart. And that comes from this verse.
That's beautiful, actually. Wow.
We know it. We know so much in our head. I know this is right. I know this is true. I know this is good.
Right.
And yet, I can't live it. It's too hard. It's such a strain.
Wow.
The person that knows smoking's wrong, but they can't they find themselves finding they're finding their nicotine. And understanding that. V'yadata hayom, you should know. And you should put it in your heart. Rabbi Stuart Salanter's, methodology was to basically try to get the lines talking here. You have to know something to be true. You have to appreciate it as such. You have to study it intellectually, but that's not going to get you over the threshold because our emotions are so intense sometimes. They're so strong. We want what we want so deeply and so badly. And we don't care that our brain knows it to be true. Mm-hmm. But now we're in trouble. Because the conflict between those, he said, almost inevitably your emotions are going to win out because they're so intense and they almost don't care what the brain says. And so his goal was to try to bridge the gap through what he called Musar. And it was an intense study, not just an intellectual study, but a goal to get ourselves engaged emotionally in the true concept. So wherever a person struggles, he recommended taking a verse in the Torah, wherever, in any part of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses and the prophets and in the writings, find the verse that talks about that, or find an ethical saying about that, and then get yourself emotionally invested in that statement and sing it, hum it, scream it. They used to have musar houses where people would engage in this very loud emotional process to drive that which I know in my brain to be right and good into my heart so that I feel it, I live it, I experience it, and that becomes, quote unquote, who I am or how I live. Nice. Because this brain knowledge is just, unfortunately, not enough to take us over the hump of our the power of our emotions. I can speak from my own experiences, when faced sometimes with those difficult moral dilemmas. Wow, they can be intense sometimes, really, really difficult. I want this thing.
Yep.
I want that chocolate cake now, but I'm on that diet, okay? And it can obviously range in severity, but understanding that it's our responsibility to get ourselves here. And there's a way to, in Rabbi Strauss Salantra's way, is this very engaged emotional process to get ourselves there. Sorry, you're going to say something, Ryan.
That's okay. I was following you along so much I forgot what I was going to say. So you're good. Okay. Go ahead. If I think of it, I'll try to interject it.
Sure. So. And I want to continue because it would be remiss if we don't touch a little bit more on the Decalogue in chapter 5, verse 1. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm God. I'm your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. It's interesting. The commentators point out why God introduces himself in the Decalogue, specifically as the God who took the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt versus the God that created the world. And the answer that really resonates with me that I've seen is that God is interacting with the world. It's not just simply that God created the world and kind of, I'm going to set this thing in motion and all good to go. God says, I took you out of the land of Egypt. I was there for you in the hard times. I interacted with the world, and there's a relationship. We call God one of the ways that we refer to God is Elokim Chaim, the God of life, not just physically giving life, but the live God, the God who exists, who's part and parcel in the world. As King David said, I believe it's a statement of King David in Tehillim and Psalms, Imo Anochi B'tzara, I'm with you in pain. God says, you're in pain, I'm in pain with you. You're not alone. I'm with you. And God says, I am with you. I was with you in Egypt. It looked bleak and looked terrible. And there's obviously a ton to talk about in that regard. But just to understand, God says, I introduce myself as the God who interacts in reality, who interacts with the world. I didn't just leave it and set it in motion to go on its own. That's a really powerful concept. And then I want to point out something that the commentators, they connect the 10 commandments. They connect 1 to 10 and 2 to 9, 3 to 8, etc. So there's kind of different ways of how the 5 and 5, so to speak, each side of the luchot of the tablets, how they connect. And I want to just point out one of them, which is that connection between number 1 and number 10, like the connection between I believe in a God and not to covet. And we can be jealous or we can be envious of another person's, stature in life, of their money, of their fame, of their children, whatever it is. There's so many different facets that we can covet or desire. So what's the connection between 1 and 10? And the answer that I've heard might as well be from Rabbi Tauber. He pointed out, he said, you're not jealous of somebody else's glasses prescription. You might be jealous of their glasses. Like, gosh, that guy's got a nicer pair of glasses than I do. Yeah. But you're not jealous of their prescription. Like, I wish I had his prescription. It's like, no, this prescription is actually the right one for my eyes, and it's probably not the right one for somebody else's eyes. And so when we start to understand God is interacting with the world, and God is giving each of us exactly what we need, tailor-made perfectly for our circumstances, and having anything else would just be like having somebody else's glasses on. You wouldn't be able to do what you need to do in this world. If you're on the side of the road and you've got a flat tire and somebody else has, their engine just blew out, it's like, okay, I don't need a new engine. I just need a tire. God is like tailor-making everything. And the more we ingrain that attitude, it doesn't matter what somebody else has. I need to have all the things that God gave me are perfect for me. That doesn't just mean my material goods. That doesn't mean, the car that I have or the house. That also means that means every person that's in my life is the right person for me. That means my spouse is the right spouse for me. Of course, there's a concept of divorce. And of course, as a marriage and family therapist, I understand that. I'm saying when we start, the first place to look is okay, God gave this to me. Why is it here for me? He didn't give me that other person's house. He didn't give me that other person's vacation. He didn't give me that other person's clothing. He gave me what he gave me specifically. And how do I utilize this to serve God the best way that I can? I'll just disclose something personal. Unfortunately, we had a fire in our house. It's very sad, and this is in the early January. And we really almost lost basically the entire house. We're still a little bit, we're still we're still renting a home. And my wife and I were talking a lot, and we really, we were talking about how much we wanted the house to be rebuilt and all the things that we were looking to do. And gosh, can't we get this thing started? And it was kind of frustrating. My wife gave me such a beautiful reframe, which I've really taken to heart and really kind of simmered down for me, the urgency of getting our house rebuilt. She said, I don't say it in Hebrew, what she said, she speaks English, but she's an English-speaking person, she's from New Jersey, but she said, our avoda doesn't change. Our service won't change any bit, whether in this house or our rental house. The service of God that we do will pretty much look the same, whether we're in here or here. If we have a bigger kitchen or a smaller kitchen, our kids are going to be the same way, and we're going to have to relate to them. And our relationship is going to be pretty much the same. And our study of Torah and our prayers and all of the things that we do, they're not going to change that dramatically, whether we're in house A or house B, whether we're living this part of the neighborhood or that part of the neighborhood. And I thought that was such a fantastic way to think about it. But I think it really connects to this Numbers 1 and 10 of the Decalogue. God says, I'm involved in the world. And by the way, everything you have is also my involvement in the world. Doesn't mean you can't buy something. It just means that sense of I wish I had your life. I wish I had what you had. No, God says, that wouldn't get you where you wanted to go anyway. That wouldn't perfect your soul's transformation in this universe. That's not what you need. That's not the prescription for you. So it's a really powerful, powerful concept. Let's finish with, I'll share one more thought.
Okay.
There's as well in the Decalogue in 5:16, it says, honor your parents. Honor your father and your mother. So there's a statement in the Talmud, and we have many great people who really served their parents in such very core mitzvah, very core commandment. And the Talmud describes, I believe this is in Tractate Kiddushin, that it describes the level of care that some individuals over the generations have had towards their parents. We learned about the Dama ben Netina was his name, who the sages came to him. This is, I believe it's folio 30, page 30 in Tractate Kiddushin. He said that the sages came to him. They said they had heard that he had a stone for the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, and they were looking to purchase it. And his father was resting, and they wanted to purchase it for a considerable sum. And he told them that unfortunately the key for the stone is under his head, and he's sleeping right now, and I can't wake him up. Now that is a tremendous level of sensitivity to his father's rest. And the sages moved on, and they looked elsewhere to find one. And they lost out on this business deal. Now, not every father would appreciate that sensitivity, although some people really like their sleep. But in either case, a tremendous level of sensitivity to one's parents and how to treat them. And one of the sages in the Talmud says, Esav, who Judaism doesn't look as with such favorable light, Jacob's twin brother Esau. It says when he went to serve his father Isaac, he would put on his finest clothing, regal clothing to serve his father. And the question is, and the sage in the Talmud says, I wasn't like Esav. I didn't put on my best clothing when I would honor my father. And the question's asked is but why didn't he? Why didn't he just put on his nicest clothing? If he knew that Esav did it, so why didn't he just do what Esav did, put on his finest clothing? There's a very fascinating concept that comes out of this, which is if I'm not at this, at the level where that action holds integrity for who I am, then it's not the right thing for me to do. In other words, for this sage to simply parrot Esav's actions by putting on his finest clothing for his father, but that really wasn't who he was. That wasn't at the level where he had reached to appreciate that action. Then don't do it. There's a difference between the things that we are obligated to do and the things that are extra nice to do. The niceties, so the things that we're obligated to do, we kind of have to do them whether we like it or not. Whether we like it or not, it's definitely good to start liking the things that we're obligated to do. It's definitely good to start feeling like I don't want to engage in the things that I'm not supposed to engage in. By and large, if you have a desire to steal, it's good to learn how to not like stealing. I don't want to touch another person's possessions. Things that don't belong to me are like, are in the Hebrew word is treif. They're not kosher. I don't want to have them. But what about the things that are the extras? So from here, we really learn a powerful concept. If you're not there, if it's not you, if it's not organic to who you are, then don't just do it just because it's somebody else did it. It's kind of like back to what we were talking about earlier with the 10th commandment. If it doesn't belong to you, if it's not in your spiritual purview, that just mimicking somebody else's action might not be it. I want to put that back to one of those earlier concepts that we said. When Moshe looked at the land of Israel, his brain, his concept, he had an expansion of appreciation of a new kinds of spirituality. But that doesn't necessarily mean to act on it. It might not be who you are at this stage. And it might be not in concert. It's like a caricature, when a particular feature is very big, the ears are big or the eyes are big because the person has big eyes or something like that. We want our actions to be in concert and organic to who we are. And to just jump because somebody else did it. Somebody else doing it means, wow, somebody else did it. I have to think what aspect, if any, applies to me. Does this apply to me? Or is it just like, wow, I'm inspired that somebody else did something like that. And that takes some delicate, evaluation, whether this particular action is really germane to who I am as a person, or whether that's just an inspirational story that's good, good to inspire us, but not necessarily to apply at this time to our lives. I think I'm going to leave it there, wil'liam, and I'm happy to field any questions. I really appreciate your time and happy to take any questions.
That is okay. No, you did good. This is not a bad time to square away. It was nice hitting these points that you brought out some things that I had never considered, like especially with Moshe Rabbeinu, and as far as just being a good human, as far as how we should be and towards Hashem and towards each other. That was pretty nice. I really enjoyed that. So it was very good, very good. So I'm looking forward to having you back again one of these days. That's not that I'm wishing Rafi Mollot to take more breaks, but if he does, you're certainly welcome.
So appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Very
good. Very good. All right. Well, you should have a good one, and thank you all for tuning in. And we'll see you same time, same place next week. Hashem willing. Rabbi, have a great one, and we'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody for watching, and thanks, wil'liam. Really appreciate it.
You bet. And I'll chat with you after we're done here in just a few minutes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks.
Shalom, my dear friends, followers, and supporters of Tanakh Talk. I would like for you, if you find this channel helpful in any way, and if it has benefited you, please consider supporting Tanakh Talk on a monthly basis. For the first time in 8 years, Baruch Hashem, I am now working Tanakh Talk full-time. So having your consistent support is more important now than ever before. The long-term benefits will be excellent. I am finally able to invest the time and energy into the channel that I had intended on in the very beginning, bringing on more shows with more varieties of teachers and more types of classes. The ultimate goal will be to have 12 to 15 shows per week, plus a lot more. Now, this is going to take some time, of course, but this is the direction that the channel is certainly headed. Also, I'm having a new website built by donors that's going to be more interactive and useful for everyone. Up until now, YouTube has been my only go-to for most everything Tanakh Talk related, with the exception of the donate button. The new website will completely override the entire website with a slightly different branding curve as well. Same Tanakh Talk, correct spelling. Praise Hashem, with this new website build, the resources will be much easier to locate and utilize. It will also allow me to send out bulk update emails on a fairly regular basis. There's much more to say, but in an effort to keep this video as short as possible, I will end with this. Many of you have been donating for a very long time. Some of you are new. Some of you have been with me since the beginning. That has been very key in keeping this program running for so long. So with all my heart and all my family's heart, thank you so much for your steady support. This is merely the beginning of a long journey, however, and I would be honored to have you all join me along the way. Shalom with Lots of love from Tanakh Talk and the Hall family. If you are planning on starting to donate now, just simply go to PayPal and just search for Tanakh Talk by using the email address, tanakhtalk@gmail.com. Patreon is similar, but you can type it in the URL, patreon.com, patreon.com/Tanakh Talk. Thank you again very much for your consideration.